The kindest people you know are being quietly destroyed by their own kindness, and almost none of them can see it happening. Somewhere in your life right now, there is a person draining your time, your money, your peace of mind, or your self-respect, and you keep showing up for them because you believe that walking away would make you a bad person. It wouldn't. In the next few minutes, I'm going to name 8 specific types of people that psychology, history, and hard experience all agree you should stop rescuing. And I'm going to show you exactly why continuing to help them isn't virtue. It's self-destruction wearing a halo. Let's start with the first one, because it's the most common and the most disguised. Issues type 1, the chronic victim. This is the person for whom nothing is ever their fault. The relationship failed because the partner was crazy. The job was lost because the boss was a tyrant. The friendship ended because everyone else is toxic. At first, you feel compassion. Everyone deserves a listening ear when life is unfair. But months pass, and the story never changes. The cast of villains rotates, but the plot stays identical. The world did this to me, and I am powerless to do anything but suffer it. Psychologists have a name for the internal architecture that produces this. It's called an external locus of control, a term coined by psychologist Julian Rotter in 1954. People with an external locus of control believe that outcomes in their life are governed by forces outside themselves, luck, other people, fate, rather than their own choices. What makes this dangerous isn't the belief itself, it's what the belief does to the person who holds it. If nothing is your fault, then nothing is your responsibility to fix. And if nothing is your responsibility to fix, then the only thing left to do with your suffering is broadcast it to whoever will listen, especially to whoever will fix it for you. This is where you come in. The chronic victim doesn't want a solution. If you're paying close attention, you'll notice that every time you offer one, a job lead, a way to leave the bad relationship, a boundary they could set, they find a reason it won't work. Not because the reason is true, but because a working solution would end the story, and the story is the only thing generating attention, sympathy, and emotional rescue from people like you. You are not being asked to help. You are being cast in a supporting role in a tragedy that has no scheduled ending. Here's the psychological trap for you personally. Helping a chronic victim feels good in the moment because it activates the same neural reward circuitry as any act of altruism. The anterior insular and ventral striatum light up when we perceive ourselves as the rescuer. But that reward is a lie your brain tells you, because the actual outcome, measured over months, not minutes, is that the person doesn't improve, your resources deplete, and the relationship curdles into resentment on both sides. They resent you for not fixing what can't be fixed by anyone but them. You resent them for taking without ever changing. The way to recognize a chronic victim early is simple. Ask yourself whether the story you're hearing has been essentially the same for the last year, with only the names changed. If it has, you are not looking at a person in crisis. You are looking at a person in a role, and the role has an opening for you specifically. The rescuer. And the moment you accept the role, you extend the play by another act. There's a related concept from clinical psychology called the Karpman drama triangle, first mapped out by psychiatrist Stephen Karpman in 1968, which describes 3 interlocking roles that recur across dysfunctional relationships: the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. What Karpman noticed is that these roles are not fixed, they rotate. The person you rescue today can become, without warning, the person who resents and attacks you tomorrow, because the rescuer role secretly requires a victim to justify its own existence, and the moment you stop rescuing, the person who has been cast as victim often flips into persecutor, accusing you of abandonment, coldness, or betrayal. This is precisely why so many people who finally stop enabling a chronic victim describe the dang bizarre experience. The gratitude they expected for years of support never arrives. What arrives instead is fury, because in the logic of the triangle, stepping out of the rescuer role isn't perceived as freedom. It's perceived as an attack on the very system that had organized the relationship for years. Understanding this in advance, is what allows you to withstand it without doubting your decision the moment it happens. Type 2, the serial complainer, the person who has turned grievance into a personality. This one is distinct from the victim, and the distinction matters. The victim believes they are powerless. The serial complainer knows exactly how powerful they are, powerful enough to make every room they enter revolve around what's wrong with it. The weather is wrong. The coffee is wrong. The government, the traffic, the neighbors, the price of everything. All wrong, all the time, and always narrated to you in exhausting, specific detail. Researchers at Stanford studying the neurological effects of prolonged complaining found something the friends of chronic complainers have known instinctively for years. Exposure to 30 minutes of complaining, even complaining you are not personally the target of, measurably impairs problem-solving ability in the listener, because the brain's those neurons that fire during negative venting begin to fire in the listener too, through a process called neuronal mirroring. In plain terms, complaining is contagious, in the same neurological sense that a yawn is contagious. When you sit and absorb someone's grievance for the 10th time this month, you are not being a good friend. You are being infected, on purpose, by someone who has learned that misery shared is misery halved at your expense. Here's what makes the serial complainer dangerous to help. Unlike almost every other type on this list, they usually aren't asking for anything material. They don't want your money or your time in the traditional sense. What they want is your nervous system. They want to borrow your calm and hand you back their chaos. And because there's no obvious ask, no favor being requested, most people never clock it as a form of taking at all. It feels like conversation. It is, in fact, a withdrawal from an account you didn't know you were funding. The tell that separates a person going through a hard week from a serial complainer is gratitude or the absence of it. A person having a hard week, when you offer comfort or a solution, will often say some version of thank you that actually helps. The serial complainer will find a reason your comfort doesn't help and pivot immediately to the next grievance. That's the signature, not the complaining itself. Everyone complains, but the total absence of any complaint ever being resolved, because resolution was never the goal. Attention was. There's also a subtler variant of the serial complainer worth naming, because it's the one that traps genuinely thoughtful people specifically. The complainer who frames every grievance as a request for your opinion, so that listening feels like an intellectual exercise rather than an emotional drain. What do you think I should do about it? Sounds like a real question. But if you track the pattern across weeks, the question is never actually answered by anything you say, because it was never a request for analysis. It was a request for airtime, delivered in a format designed to make you feel useful while you supplied it. The giveaway is that your answer, however carefully reasoned, produces no behavioral change whatsoever, and the same question resurfaces days later, wearing a slightly different outfit. Recognizing this format doesn't mean refusing to listen to anyone who's struggling. It means noticing when your listening has become a fixture of someone's routine rather than a response to an actual event, and adjusting your availability to match reality rather than the story being told to you. Once you can see these two types clearly, the victim who refuses the cure and the complainer who refuses the comfort, you start to notice something uncomfortable about yourself. You've likely spent years mistaking your availability for their improvement. It never was. And the sooner you separate those two things, the sooner your empathy stops being harvested by fire. People who have no intention of using it to change. Type 3, the guilt tripper, the manipulator who has weaponized your conscience. This type operates on a completely different mechanism than the first two, and it's more dangerous precisely because it doesn't look like manipulation at all. It looks like love, or loyalty, or family duty. The guilt tripper rarely asks you directly for what they want. Instead, they engineer a feeling in you, usually shame, sometimes obligation, occasionally fear of being seen as selfish, and they let that feeling do the asking for them. After everything I've done for you, I guess I'll just handle it myself, like always. It's fine. Don't worry about me. Each phrase is a small trapdoor. built to drop you into compliance without ever making a direct request you could actually evaluate and refuse. Social psychologists studying compliance identify this as a form of what's called the negative state relief mechanism, first documented by researcher Robert Cialdini in his work on influence. When a person induces discomfort in you, your brain seeks the fastest available route back to comfort, and very often that route is simply giving the manipulator what they wanted in the first place. The guilt tripper has, whether consciously or not, discovered a shortcut around your reasoning entirely. They don't need to convince you their request is fair. They only need to make refusing it feel unbearable. What separates a guilt tripper from someone who has a legitimate grievance about your behavior is the presence or absence of specificity. A person with a real complaint tells you exactly what happened and exactly what they need. You canceled on me twice this month, and I need you to follow through next time. A guilt tripper stays vague on purpose, because vagueness is what keeps the trapdoor working. If they specified the actual request, you could evaluate it on its merits and say no cleanly. Vagueness converts every interaction into an emotional test you can only fail. Helping a guilt tripper doesn't reduce their guilt tripping, it rewards it. Every time you comply with an engineered feeling instead of a stated need, you are running an experiment that proves to their nervous system that the tactic works, and behavior that works gets repeated in humans exactly as in every other trainable organism. This is operant conditioning in its purest form, and most people administering the reinforcement have no idea they're doing it, because it's disguised as being a good son, a good friend, a good partner. What makes guilt specifically, as opposed to anger or sadness, such an effective lever is its unique relationship to identity. Anger directed at you can be dismissed as someone else's problem. Guilt cannot, because guilt only functions if you'd when so. Guilt cannot deseld, nantrinenit. Guilt cannot deseld, nantrinenit. Guilt cannot deseld, nantrinenit. Guilt cannot deseld, nantrinenit. Guilt cannot deseld. Guilt cannot deseld. Then this you already accepted the underlying premise that you did something wrong, or are obligated to fix something you didn't cause. This is why the antidote isn't defending yourself point by point. Arguing against a vague accusation only legitimizes it as a real accusation worth debating. The antidote is asking, calmly and specifically, for the actual request underneath the feeling. It sounds like there's something you need from me. What is it exactly? This single question does something the guilt tripper's tactic depends on you never doing. It forces the vague emotional signal to convert into a concrete, evaluable request. Concrete requests can be granted or declined on their merits. Vague feelings can only be complied with or endured. And a person who has relied on vagueness for years will often, remarkably, back down the moment they're asked to name what they actually want, because naming it removes the very ambiguity the tactic was built on. Asterisk type 4, the habitual taker, the relationship with no reciprocity built into its architecture. This type is quieter than the guilt tripper and doesn't require manipulation at all, because you've already agreed to the terms. You simply never noticed you agreed. The habitual taker isn't scheming. They have simply learned, over the whole course of knowing you, that you are the one who arrives early, stays late, covers the bill, drives the distance, remembers the birthday, and asks for nothing back. And rather than question that arrangement, they have quietly built their entire relationship with you around it. There's a concept in social exchange theory, developed by sociologist George Homans, that every relationship, friendship, romantic, familial, professional, operates on an implicit ledger of costs and benefits, even when neither party would ever describe it in those terms. Healthy relationships maintain rough reciprocity over time. The ledger doesn't need to balance every week, but across months and years, both people give and both people receive. What defines the habitual taker is not that they take once, everyone takes sometimes, but that the ledger has been unbalanced for so long that neither of you can remember what balance would even look like. The reason this type is so easy to miss is that habitual takers are rarely rude about it. They say thank you. They seem genuinely fond of you. The taking isn't hostile, it's structural. It happened because you never once, in the entire history of the relationship, tested what would happen if you needed something back. And the danger of leaving that untested is that resentment accumulates on a delay. You won't feel it during the giving. You'll feel it 3 years later, seemingly out of nowhere, as a wave of anger towards someone who, from their own perspective, never did anything wrong, because you never told them there was anything to correct. The test for a habitual taker is simple, and almost nobody runs it. Ask for something, not a favor disguised as small talk, an actual, specific need. Watch what happens. A person capable of reciprocity will show up, even imperfectly. A true habitual taker will suddenly discover they're busy, or minimize your need compared to theirs, or simply not respond. And in that single moment of silence, you will learn more about the relationship than 5 years of one-sided giving ever taught you. There's an important nuance that separates a habitual taker from someone who is simply going through an unusually hard stretch of life, and missing it leads good people to cut off relationships that didn't deserve it, or worse, to stay in ones that did. The nuance is duration measured against capacity. Someone recovering from a genuine crisis, illness, grief, a sudden financial collapse, will take more than they give for a period, and that period has a shape. It eventually narrows as their capacity returns, even if they never explicitly acknowledge the imbalance happened. A habitual taker's imbalance has no shape. It doesn't narrow when their circumstances improve. If anything, it widens, because the ledger was never something they were tracking as a temporary deficit. It was simply how the relationship worked from day one. The diagnostic question then isn't, are they taking more than giving right now? Almost everyone does at some point. The question is whether their capacity to reciprocate has ever, at any point across the entire relationship, actually translated into reciprocity. Because a taker whose circumstances improve while your circumstances remain the same has revealed something no crisis ever could. We've covered 4 types now: the victim who refuses the cure, the complainer who refuses comfort, the guilt tripper who manipulates your conscience, and the taker who's built an entire relationship on an invisible imbalance. Every one of these types shares a hidden thread. They don't need you to be unkind to them. They need you to keep being kind to yourself less. Keep that thread in mind, because the next 4 types push this idea even further into people who don't just take your help, but actively resist being helped in the first place, and people who take your help and turn around to use it against you. Type 5. The learned helpless, the person who has trained themselves out of their own competence. In 1967, psychologist Martin Seligman ran an experiment that would end up reshaping how we understand human motivation. Dogs were placed in a shuttle box, divided by a low barrier. On one side, an electric floor delivered a mild shock. On the other side, there was none. Dogs who had never been shocked before quickly learned to jump the barrier to escape. But dogs who had previously been exposed to shocks, they had no ability to stop. Shocks that came, regardless of what they did, simply lay down and endured it, even when the barrier in front of them was low enough to clear in a single leap, and escape was completely available. Seligman called this learned helplessness, the state in which an organism, having previously experienced a situation where its actions had no effect, stops attempting to act at all, even once action would work. Humans do this too, and it looks nothing like laziness, even though it gets mistaken for laziness constantly. A person who applied for 40 jobs and got 40 rejections stops applying, not because they've become lazy, but because their nervous system has run the experiment and concluded that effort doesn't serve. Change outcome. A person who tried for years to make a marriage work and failed anyway stops trying in the next Jamal before it's even tested. The behavior looks identical to giving up. The origin is entirely different. It's a nervous system that has been taught, through repetition, that trying is pointless. Here's where this becomes a who not to help problem rather than a who to have compassion for problem, And the distinction matters enormously, because you should absolutely have compassion for learned helplessness. What you should not do is become the barrier jumper on their behalf. If you consistently solve the problems that a learned helpless person needs to solve themselves, making the calls they're avoiding, doing the job search for them, managing the confrontation they're afraid to have, you are not curing their helplessness. You are proving their core belief correct, that their own actions don't produce the outcome. The only thing that produces the outcome is someone else stepping in. Every time you jump the barrier for them, you make it slightly less likely they'll ever discover they could have jumped it themselves. The uncomfortable psychological truth here is that some of the most damaging help in human relationships isn't help that's withheld, it's help that arrives too early, before the person has had the chance to fail enough times to prove to their own mind that failure isn't fatal. Seligman's later research, decades after the original dog experiments, found something equally important. Roughly a third of the dogs never became helpless at all, even after repeated inescapable shocks. What separated them wasn't the shocks. Every dog got the same shocks. It was something closer to a prior history of mastery, a track record of situations where their actions had worked. The intervention that actually reverses learned helplessness in humans isn't rescue. It's engineered opportunities for the person to discover, through their own effort, that action produces outcome again. That's a fundamentally different thing from you doing it for them. And confusing the two is one of the most common and most well-intentioned mistakes a caring person makes. There's a practical version of this distinction that plays out constantly in families and workplaces, and it's worth naming precisely because the two behaviors look almost identical from the outside. Scaffolding is help that's structured to be temporary and removable. You show someone how to do the thing once, you stand nearby while they attempt it themselves, and you withdraw as their competence grows, exactly the way scaffolding comes down once a building can stand on its own. Rescue is help that solves the problem completely, permanently, and without requiring any capability from the person on the receiving end. From the outside, both can look like generosity in a single moment. Over months, they produce opposite outcomes. Scaffolding produces a person who no longer needs you for that particular problem, while rescue produces a person who needs you for that particular problem indefinitely, because the muscle required to solve it was never given the chance to develop. If you notice that someone you'd been helping needs you exactly as much today as they did a year ago, for exactly the same category of problem, you are not looking at scaffolding, you are looking at rescue, dressed up as ongoing support. Type 6. The ungrateful receiver, the person for whom every gift becomes an entitlement. There's a particular kind of disappointment that only shows up after your guard. Minau insings offersortseer. Dessoesbri so de fesse. Issue. Discussions helped someone for a long time, and it usually arrives in a single, small, almost absurd moment. You've covered rent for a friend for 8 months. On month 9, you're late by 3 days because of your own emergency. And instead of understanding, you get anger. Not gratitude for the 8 months, anger for the one delay. In that moment, something becomes visible that had been invisible the entire time. The help had quietly stopped being perceived as a gift and had been silently reclassified in the receiver's mind as an obligation you owed them. This transition has a name in behavioral economics. It's related to what researchers call the endowment effect, first documented by Richard Thaler, in which people assign more value to things they possess than things they don't yet have, purely because they now possess them. Applied to ongoing help, the pattern extends further. Consistent giving, over time, gets absorbed into a person's baseline expectation of reality. The help stops being an addition to their life that they're grateful for, and becomes the floor beneath which anything less feels like a loss. This is why the parent who pays a grown child's expenses for a decade is met with fury, not appreciation, the 1 year they say no. The child isn't being uniquely awful. Their brain has done exactly what human brains do with sustained input. It built a new baseline and measured everything else as gain or loss relative to that baseline, not relative to zero. The reason this type is worth naming specifically, separate from the habitual taker, is the emotional charge involved. A habitual taker simply doesn't reciprocate. There's an absence. An ungrateful receiver actively resents you for any reduction in help, which is a presence, an active emotional response, and it's far more corrosive to your own psychology because it inverts the entire relationship. You end up apologizing for not doing enough, for a person you have already sacrificed enormously for. That inversion, where the giver ends up defending themselves to the receiver, is the clearest signal available that the relationship has crossed from generosity into what feels, to the receiver, like a debt you owe them for existing. The corrective here isn't to stop giving. It's to occasionally, deliberately, let the receiver feel the actual size of what they've been given, by briefly removing it, not out of cruelty, but because gratitude, psychologically, requires contrast. A benefit that never fluctuates is invisible to the nervous system. It becomes wallpaper. This is precisely why hedonic adaptation, the well-documented tendency for humans to return to a stable baseline of satisfaction, regardless of positive or negative events, applies to receiving help exactly as it applies to salary increases or new possessions. Continuous, unbroken generosity doesn't produce continuous gratitude. It produces continuous expectation. And a person whose expectation has replaced their gratitude will make you feel guilty for the exact same behavior that used to make them thankful. Type 7. The saboteur. The person who resents your progress even while accepting your help. This is, without question, the most disturbing type on this list, because it inverts the basic logic of helping entirely. Every type so far has taken your help passively, or extracted it through guilt, or absorbed it without gratitude. The saboteur does something stranger. They accept your help, and then work, sometimes consciously, sometimes in ways they work. They never admit even to themselves, to make sure your life doesn't improve beyond a level they can tolerate. There's a well-documented social phenomenon behind this called the crab bucket effect. The saboteur is originally about actual crabs in a bucket, that no single crab needs a lid to keep it contained, because any crab attempting to climb out gets pulled back down by the others. Applied to people, the mechanism is social comparison theory, developed by psychologist Leon Festinger in 1954, which holds that humans evaluate their own worth largely by comparing themselves to those around them, rather than against any objective standard. For someone whose entire sense of self-worth is built on comparison rather than internal accomplishment, your rise is not neutral information. It's a direct threat to their self-concept. If you succeed while they stagnate, the gap between you becomes evidence, in their mind, of their own inadequacy, and rather than sit with that evidence, some people would rather quietly work to close the gap by pulling you back down instead of building themselves up. What makes this genuinely hard to detect is that saboteurs rarely oppose you directly. Direct opposition would be too visible, too easy to name and reject. Instead, the sabotage arrives dressed as concern. Are you sure you're ready for that promotion? Remember what happened last time you overcommitted? I just don't want you to get hurt again. Not everyone needs to see this success. You don't want to come across as bragging. Each sentence sounds like care. Each sentence, examined closely, functions to introduce doubt at precisely the moment your confidence needed reinforcement, or to shrink your visible success at precisely the moment it needed to be witnessed. The specific danger of helping a saboteur, as opposed to simply having them in your life, is that helping them typically means investing in their growth, their business, their goals, their emotional recovery, in the hope that your success will lift them alongside you. It rarely does, and the reason is structural, not personal. A person whose identity is built on comparison doesn't actually want equality with you. Equality removes the comparison entirely. What they unconsciously want is for the gap to stay wide enough that they have someone to measure themselves against, and safe enough that the direction of the gap never threatens to reverse. Helping this person succeed, ironically, sometimes triggers more resentment than helping them fail, because success changes the terms of the comparison in ways their psychology isn't equipped to metabolize. The identifying signal is this: watch what happens to their warmth toward you at the exact moment something goes right in your life. A person who is genuinely for you will show more warmth when you succeed, not less. A saboteur's warmth will cool subtly, precisely when your success is at its peak, and it will return just as subtly the next time something in your life goes wrong. If you notice your setbacks bring someone closer and your victories push them away, you are not looking at a friend who is simply awkward with praise. You are looking at a relationship whose stability depends on your stagnation. It's worth being precise about what separates a saboteur from a person who is simply, understandably, a little envious in a passing moment. Because envy itself is a normal, universal human response, and treating every flicker of it as a character indictment would leave you isolated from almost everyone. The distinction is whether the envy stays a private, momentary feeling that the person manages on their own, or whether it converts into action directed at you, the subtle discouragement, the unsolicited doubt, the sudden absence at exactly the moment celebration was called for. Nearly everyone will feel a pang of envy watching someone they love surpass them. What separates a saboteur is that the pang never stays private. It leaks, consistently, into behavior aimed at narrowing the gap from their side by shrinking you rather than growing themselves. And once you can see that leak clearly, it becomes very difficult to unsee. Type 8. The one in denial, the person who refuses to acknowledge the problem exists at all. The 7 types before this one all involve a person who, on some level, acknowledges a problem, a hard circumstance, a bad habit, a painful pattern, even if they mismanage it, exploit it, or refuse to fix it. The 8th type is different, and in some ways more frustrating than all of them combined, because there is no problem to solve in their account of things. The addiction isn't a problem, it's controlled. The relationship isn't abusive, it's complicated. The financial situation isn't dangerous, it's temporary. Every attempt you make to help gets rejected before it can even begin. Not because the help is bad, but because accepting help would require first admitting there's something to be helped with. This maps directly onto what psychologists call the stages of change model, developed by researchers James Prochaska and Carlo Di Clemente in the late 1970s, originally to study how people quit smoking. The model identifies 5 stages a person moves through when changing any entrenched behavior: pre-contemplation, where the person doesn't yet see the behavior as a problem; contemplation, where they begin to acknowledge it but haven't decided to act; preparation, action, and maintenance. The single most important finding from this research, replicated across decades of addiction and behavior change studies, is that interventions offered to someone in pre-contemplation don't just fail, they often backfire, triggering what's called reactance, a psychological state in which a person perceives their freedom of choice as threatened and responds by doubling down on the very behavior being challenged. This is precisely why confronting a person in denial with facts, evidence, or ultimatums so often produces the opposite of the intended effect. You are not arguing with their assessment of a situation. You are, from their internal vantage point, attacking their identity, because at the pre-contemplation stage, the problematic behavior and the sense of self are still fused together. There's no daylight between "I drink too much" and "I am someone with a drinking problem." So any suggestion of the former reads, to their nervous system, as an accusation of the latter. Helping someone who hasn't yet separated the behavior from their identity isn't help. It's an argument you cannot win, delivered to a person who experiences your concern as an assault. The single most important thing to understand about this type is that movement between these stages cannot be forced from the outside. It can only be catalyzed, usually by the accumulation of consequences the person can no longer explain away, or by a single moment vivid enough to crack the denial open on its own. Your job, when someone is in pre-contemplation, is not to be the crack. It's to make sure that when the crack eventually happens, and for most people, eventually it does, you are still standing close enough and healthy enough yourself to be useful in the moment they're finally ready to receive it. That is an entirely different form of presence than the exhausting, repetitive, doomed effort to convince someone of a truth their own psychology isn't yet built to hold. We've now covered all 8: the victim, the complainer, the guilt tripper, the taker, the learned helpless, the ungrateful receiver, the saboteur, and the one in denial. 8 distinct psychological mechanisms. 8 distinct reasons your help does not produce the outcome you're hoping for. What remains is the hardest part, not identifying these people, which you can now do with far more precision than you could an hour ago, but building the actual, internal framework that lets you withhold help without withholding your humanity, and that's where we're going next. The first mistake almost everyone makes at this point is treating the decision to stop helping as a moral verdict on the person, as though recognizing someone as a chronic taker requires you to also decide they're a bad human being, unworthy of compassion. That's not the distinction psychology actually supports, and it's not the distinction that will let you act on any of this without guilt eating you alive later. The relevant question was never, is this a good person or a bad person? The relevant question is, does my help in this specific relationship function as medicine or as a substitute for the cure? Medicine treats a condition and, over time, becomes unnecessary as the condition resolves. A substitute for the cure relieves the symptom permanently, in a way that removes any pressure on the underlying problem to ever resolve, which means the help becomes required forever, at your expense forever. This single test, does this help function as medicine or as a substitute for the cure, is more useful than any moral judgment, because it doesn't require you to diagnose someone's character. It only requires you to observe outcomes. If you've been helping someone for a year, and the underlying issue is measurably smaller than it was a year ago, keep helping. It's working. If you've been helping someone for a year, and the underlying issue is exactly the same size, or larger, despite your continuous intervention, the help has stopped being medicine. It has become the thing preventing the cure from ever needing to arrive, and continuing it isn't compassion. It's a slower, gentler form of enabling that feels virtuous specifically because it's slow and gentle. There's a second framework worth holding alongside the first, and it comes from a concept economists call moral hazard, originally used to describe insurance markets, where a person who is fully protected from the consequences of risk will predictably take on more risk because the cost of failure has been transferred to someone else. The exact same mechanism operates in relationships. Every time you fully absorb the consequence of someone else's poor decision, the missed deadline, the overspending, the broken commitment, you transfer the cost of that decision from them to you, and in doing so, you remove the single strongest signal that would otherwise teach them to decide differently next time. This is not a character flaw unique to the people you've been helping. It is a universal feature of how consequence and learning are linked in every human being, including you. The people around you are not exempt from this mechanism just because you love them. If anything, love is precisely what makes people most willing to keep absorbing a cost that should belong to someone else. There's a fourth lens worth adding here, because it explains why so many capable, intelligent people still get stuck helping the wrong people for years, despite knowing better on some level. It has to do with what psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy, applied to relationships rather than money. The tendency to keep investing in something specifically because you've already invested so much, even when every available signal says the investment isn't producing a return. You'll hear this reasoning almost verbatim from people trapped in exactly this pattern. I can't stop now. I've already put 5 years into this friendship. Or, after everything I've spot, walking away now would waste it all. That logic feels intuitive and is precisely backwards. The 5 years already spent are gone regardless of what you do next. They cannot be unspent by continuing to spend more. The only real question is whether year 6 looks like year 5, and if the honest answer is yes, the sunk cost isn't a reason to continue. It's the exact evidence that continuing produces no different outcome than stopping would. None of this means becoming cold, or auditing every relationship for a perfect balance sheet of reciprocity, because a life lived that way isn't wisdom. It's a different kind of fear, dressed up as boundaries. The goal isn't to stop helping people, it's to stop helping in ways that quietly guarantee the problem's survival. There's a specific diagnostic question that separates the two, and it's worth memorizing exactly as it's phrased. If I disappeared tomorrow, would this person be forced to grow, or would they simply collapse? If the honest answer is that they'd collapse entirely, with no ability whatsoever to function, that's not always a sign to keep doing everything you're doing. Sometimes it's a sign you've already let the imbalance run so long that a full collapse is the only remaining path back to 9. Genuine capability, and your continued presence is only delaying an outcome that was always going to be necessary. If the honest answer is that they'd struggle, feel real discomfort, and then find their own way through it, discomfort you have been preventing, not danger you'd be causing, that is exactly the space where your withdrawal does more good than your continued presence ever could. This is the part almost nobody tells you because it's uncomfortable to hear. Struggle is not always the enemy of the people you love. Very often, your presence is the only thing standing between them and the specific struggle that would finally force the change nothing else has managed to force. Removing yourself from that equation isn't abandonment. In a genuine, evidence-based, psychologically documented sense, it is sometimes the single, most loving thing available to you, because it returns the problem to the only person who was ever actually capable of solving it, and it was never you. There's a final distinction worth making, because without it, everything you've just learned can curdle into the wrong lesson entirely. None of this is a case against generosity. It's a case against generosity without discernment, the specific habit of treating every sort of request for help as equally deserving of your resources, regardless of what that help actually does once it leaves your hands. The most generous people in history were rarely the ones who said yes to everyone. They were the ones who understood, with total clarity, exactly where their generosity produced growth, and exactly where it produced dependency, and they built their entire capacity for giving around that single distinction. Discernment isn't the opposite of generosity. It's the mechanism that keeps generosity from being strip-mined until nothing is left of the person offering it. Consider what actually happens to a person who never applies any of these 8 distinctions, who says yes to the chronic victim, the complainer, the guilt tripper, the taker, the learned helpless, the ungrateful receiver, the saboteur, and the one in denial, all at once, for years, because saying no feels unbearable. That person doesn't become a saint. They become depleted, and depletion has a very specific, well-documented endpoint in psychology called compassion fatigue, a state first identified in caregiving professions like nursing and emergency response, in which the capacity for empathy itself begins to shut down, not from malice, but from overuse without replenishment. The tragic irony is exact. The attempt to be endlessly available to everyone eventually produces a person who has nothing left to offer anyone, including the people who genuinely deserved their help all along, the ones going through real hardship, showing real effort, and simply needing one hand at the right moment to help them back to their feet. That's the real cost of failing to make these distinctions. It isn't just that you get taken advantage of by 8 kinds of people. It's that your finite well of compassion gets drained by the 8 types who will never use it well, leaving nothing for the people who actually would. Every yes you give to a saboteur is a no you'll place, quietly handing to someone who needed you and never got the chance to ask, because you were already empty by the time they arrived. Protecting your energy from the people who exploit it isn't selfishness. It's the only way to keep enough of yourself intact to give real help at full strength to the people who have actually earned it. There's one last inversion worth sitting with, because it reframes this entire subject in a way most people never consider. Every example covered here has focused on protecting yourself from these 8 types in other people. But the far more useful application of everything you'd fear just learned is turning each of these 8 lenses inward onto your own behavior in the relationships where you are the one receiving help. Have you at some point told the same unresolved story to a friend for a year without ever attempting the fix they offered? Have you let guilt do the asking for you, rather than stating a need directly? Have you accepted help so consistently that you stopped noticing it was a gift rather than a guarantee? The value of naming these 8 patterns clearly isn't only the power to spot them in others. It's the far rarer, far more useful power to catch yourself drifting into one of them, and to correct course while the people who love you still have something left to give. So here is the only thing left to decide, and it's not a decision about any of the 8 people you might have already pictured while listening to this. It's a decision about you. Are you willing to let a version of yourself exist that says no sometimes, that lets people fall so they can learn to stand, that gives generously but never blindly, even though that version of you will occasionally be misunderstood, occasionally called selfish, by the very people benefiting most from your old, boundaryless generosity? Because the version of you who says yes to everyone isn't actually the kindest version available. It's simply the most exhausted one, and exhaustion has never once cured another human being of anything. If this reframed how you think about the people you help, and the people helping you costs, subscribe, because there's a great deal more of this coming. Built the same way this one was, rooted in real psychology, not platitudes. Like this video, if even one of these 8 types made you think of someone specific, and share it with the one person in your life who needs to hear it before they give away one more year they can't get back.